I lost everything in divorce, inherited $340 from grandma, but had to solve mom's 40-year secret. That was the start of it all. 1 month I was living in a cardboard box, metaphorically speaking, and the next, I was staring at a number with so many zeros, it looked fake. My ex-wife Carol had taken everything. Her lawyer, a shark named Martin, had chewed me up in court and spat out the bones. They left me with nothing but debt and the echo of their laughter. Carol and her lawyer Martin had taken my home, my savings, my dignity, but they didn't know about my grandmother's will. They didn't know about the storm that was about to break over their heads. This is the story of how I'd not only get my life back, but how I'd uncover a secret that would destroy them more completely than they ever destroyed me. Lost everything in divorce, then inherited $340. But my grandma's will hid a 40-year secret. They took my home, my savings, my dignity. Subscribe and like to see how I get it all back and unleash hell. I remember the day the letter came. It was a crisp, formal envelope that looked completely out of place in my tiny, rented room that smelled of despair and instant noodles. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of. My grandmother, Rose, had passed away a few weeks earlier. I loved her dearly, but we weren't a family that talked about money. I assumed she had a small house, maybe some savings to cover her final expenses. I certainly didn't expect to be sitting in a plush leather chair in a downtown office listening to a man in a three-piece suit tell me I was the sole heir to an estate worth $340 million. The air left my lungs. I think I might have laughed, a dry, broken sound. There must be a mistake, I said. My grandmother was a librarian. She lived a simple life. The lawyer, a kind-faced man named Arthur, just smiled patiently. Your grandmother was a very careful investor, Robert. She lived modestly, but her portfolio was anything but. For a moment, all I could see was Carol's face, her smug, triumphant smile, as she walked out of the courtroom with Martin. I pictured buying the building she lived in and evicting her. I pictured buying Martin's law firm just to fire him. The thoughts were dark and satisfying. The money wasn't just money. It was power. It was ammunition. Then Arthur cleared his throat. There is, however, a condition. Of course there was. A fortune like that couldn't just fall into your lap. There had to be a catch. Your grandmother's final wish, Arthur explained, sliding a thick, sealed envelope across the polished mahogany desk, was for you to solve a mystery, a secret your mother Patricia took to her grave 40 years ago. My blood ran cold. My mother, she died when I was just a boy. A car accident, they told me. It was a closed chapter, a source of quiet, lifelong pain. What secret? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Your grandmother didn't specify in the will, Arthur said. She only left you this. I took the envelope. My name was written on the front in my grandmother's shaky, elegant handwriting. Inside was not a letter full of clues, but a single old-fashioned skeleton key and a short, cryptic note. The note read, Your mother's truth is in the city of echoes, where beginnings and endings meet. What they buried is not what they lost. Find the lock, find the truth. Only then is the fortune truly yours. City of echoes, what they buried is not what they lost. It sounded like nonsense. A riddle from a children's book. I felt a surge of frustration. My fresh start, my revenge, was locked behind a 40-year-old puzzle from a woman I barely knew. What does this mean? I asked, holding up the key. Arthur shook his head. I have no idea, Robert. That's for you to discover. You have 1 year. If you fail to provide proof that you have solved the puzzle, the entire estate will be liquidated and donated to a series of charities. 1 year. 1 year to become a detective and solve a ghost story, or my revenge on Carol and Martin would evaporate. The money would vanish. I'd be back in my sad little room with nothing but their laughter to keep me company. I walked out of that office in a daze, the heavy key feeling both like a promise and a curse in my pocket. My mind was racing. My mother Patricia had always been a sad, beautiful memory, a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. I knew so little about her life before she married my father. What secret could she have possibly had that was so important my grandmother would stake a fortune on it? I went back to my apartment and sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. I thought about Carol again. I remembered her words the last time I saw her. You're nothing without me, Robert, she had sneered, with Martin standing right behind her, a smirk on his face. You'll always be nothing. I clenched my fist around the key. No, she was wrong. I wasn't nothing. I was the heir to a fortune, and I had a mission. Solving this mystery wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about my mother. It was about my grandmother's last wish. And most of all, it was about proving to Carol, to Martin, and to the world that they had underestimated me. They had buried me, but just like the note said, what they buried is not what they lost. They had lost their worst nightmare. The first few days were a blur of cheap coffee and sleepless nights. The key felt heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the impossible task ahead. I'd stare at my grandmother's note, the words City of Echoes swirling in my mind until they lost all meaning. What did it mean? Was it a real place? A metaphor? My mother, Patricia, was a ghost to me. A collection of stories my father and grandmother told me, polished and vague. They said she was kind, that she loved books and the rain. They never said where she came from. My first instinct was to use the internet, but my resources were limited to the slow, unreliable computer at the public library. I typed in every combination I could think of. City of Echoes, secret societies, famous unsolved family mysteries. I got nothing but conspiracy theories and ads for cheap flights. It was useless. I was a man with a potential fortune of $340 million, and I couldn't even afford a decent Wi-Fi connection. The irony was bitter. I realized I was thinking like a desperate man. I needed to think like my grandmother Rose. She wasn't a woman of the digital age. Her clues would be analog, physical. They would be hidden in the real world, not in cyberspace. So I started with the only physical things I had left from my family, a single tattered box of old photos and documents that had survived my messy divorce from Carol. I'd kept it because it was worthless to her. Now it might be worth everything. I spent an entire afternoon on the floor of my room, spreading out faded black and white pictures. There was my mother as a young girl, smiling with a missing tooth. There she was on her wedding day with my father. But there was nothing from before that. No high school photos, no pictures of her parents. It was as if her life began the day she met my father. Frustrated, I was about to pack it all away when I noticed something about the box itself. It was an old shoebox, but underneath a peeling label there was a different label. It was from a storage company, Evergreen Self-Storage. It read, with an address in a town I'd never heard of, Harmony Creek. A quick search at the library told me Harmony Creek was a small, forgotten town about 3 hours away. It was an old mining town that had mostly dried up decades ago. My heart started pounding. Could this be it? Was I that close? I used the last of my savings to put gas in my beat-up car and drove. The storage facility was old and rusty, sitting on the edge of town like a forgotten relic. I showed the tired-looking man at the front desk the label from the box and explained my situation. He grunted, typed something into an ancient computer, and then looked at me with mild surprise. Unit 74, paid up for the next 50 years, he said, handing me a key. Your grandmother must have been one heck of a planner. My grandmother's key, the skeleton key from the lawyer's office. It wasn't for a diary or a secret chest. It was for this, a rusty, corrugated metal door in the middle of nowhere. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the old lock. It turned with a loud, grinding click. The door rolled up with a groan, revealing a space filled with dust and shadows. Inside were boxes, furniture covered in white sheets, and a thick smell of mothballs and time. It was a preserved piece of a life I never knew existed, my mother's life. When I finally found a small wooden chest tucked away in a corner, I thought I had found the answer. It looked important, and it was locked with a small, simple latch. I didn't need a key for this one. I pried it open with a screwdriver I found in my car. Inside were books, old vinyl records, and a leather-bound diary. This had to be it, the secret. But when I opened the diary, my hopes sank. The first dozen pages had been carefully torn out. The rest of the book was completely blank. It was empty, a dead end. I almost threw it against the wall. The frustration was so intense. But as I slammed it shut, I saw something written in faint pencil on the inside of the front cover. A few simple words. It was a man's name, not my father's. A name I'd never heard before. Vincent. And next to it, a date from 41 years ago. It wasn't a full confession. It wasn't a map. It was just a name and a date. But I still didn't know who this Vincent was, or why his was the only name my mother saved in a book of torn-out secrets. Was he the secret, or was he the key to it? The riddle had just gotten deeper, and the ghost of my mother suddenly felt a lot more real, and a lot more complicated, and for the first time I felt a flicker of fear. Maybe some secrets were buried for a reason. The name echoed in the silence of the storage unit. Vincent. It wasn't a clue. It felt like an accusation. I closed the diary, the faint scent of old paper and my mother's ghost clinging to it. I had a name, but I had no face, no story, no connection. It was like being given a single puzzle piece with no picture on the box. For a moment, the weight of the task felt crushing. Carol and Martin were probably out celebrating their victory at some expensive restaurant, laughing about how they'd crushed me. And here I was in a dusty tomb in a forgotten town, chasing a 41-year-old ghost. I locked the unit, the heavy door groaning shut, sealing my mother's past away once more. I drove into the heart of Harmony Creek. It was one of those towns that time had decided to skip over. The main street had a single traffic light, a diner with a faded neon sign, and a handful of shops with peeling paint. It was quiet, too quiet. A town that looked like it was good at keeping secrets. My grandmother was a librarian. My mother loved books. The library felt like the right place to start. It was a small brick building, and the moment I stepped inside, the smell of old books and floor polish hit me. It was a comforting smell, a scent from my childhood. An elderly man with glasses perched on the end of his nose looked up from behind a large wooden desk. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice soft. "I hope so," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm researching some family history. I was wondering if you had any local records from about 40 years ago." ago. High school yearbooks, old newspapers, that sort of thing. The librarian, whose name tag read Stanley, gave me a curious but kind smile. The Harmony Creek archives. Not many people ask for those anymore. Follow me. He led me to a back room filled with shelves of bound newspapers and dusty boxes. What year are you looking for? I gave him the date from the diary. His smile faltered for just a second, a flicker of something I couldn't read. That was a difficult year for this town, he said quietly, pulling a heavy blue-bound yearbook from a shelf. Here you go. The Harmony Creek High Gazette, class of '82. My hands felt unsteady as I took the book. I sat down at a small table and opened it. The pages were yellowed with age. I scanned the class photos, the faces of smiling teenagers frozen in time, full of hopes and dreams that were now 4 decades old. And then I found him, under the V section. Vincent. He was handsome, with dark, intense eyes and a confident smirk. He looked like the kind of boy who broke hearts and rules in equal measure. Captain of the football team, most likely to succeed. I felt a jolt of triumph. This was it. I had a face to the name. I was one step closer. I achava que tinha a identidade de Vincent. A solution. I just had to find out where he was now. Find what you were looking for? Stanley asked, walking over. I think so, I said, pointing to the picture. Do you remember this kid? Vincent? Mas, cuando Stanley looked at the photo, his face changed completely. The friendly librarian was gone, replaced by a man with old, sad eyes. So Rosto became serious, his mouth a thin line. He didn't look at the picture of Vincent. He looked at me. I remember him, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And I remember your mother, Patricia. The air in the room went still. I hadn't said my mother's name. I hadn't mentioned her at all. My heart hammered against my ribs. How did you know? He ignored my question, his gaze fixed on my face. You have her eyes, he said softly. Then he looked back at the yearbook, his expression hardening. That name brings back bad memories. What happened that year? It nearly tore this town apart. Some things are better left buried. His words hung in the air, heavy and cold. This wasn't just some teenage romance my mother had. This was something much darker. Something an entire town had conspired to forget. What happened? I pressed, my voice urgent. Stanley shook his head slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. That's not my story to tell, he said, closing the yearbook with a quiet finality. Some doors, once closed, should never be opened again, son. I stared at the closed book. The smiling face of Vincent now burned into my mind. Stanley's words were a clear warning, but all I could hear was the clock ticking on my 1-year deadline. The fortune, my revenge on Carol and Martin, was on the other side of that closed door. What happened 41 years ago that was so terrible people still wouldn't talk about it? And what did my kind, quiet mother have to do with it? Stanley's warning was like a locked gate, but instead of turning me away, it just made me want to find a way to climb over it. Some doors should never be opened again, he'd said. He was wrong. This door had $340 million behind it, and more importantly, it held the key to my future. A future where Carol and Martin weren't laughing anymore. Their faces, so smug and victorious in the courtroom, were burned into my memory. That memory was the fuel, and my mother's secret was the match. I left the library, the heavy yearbook still feeling imprinted on my hands. Harmony Creek was a town drowning in its own silence. Every closed curtain, every peeling paint sign seemed to whisper, we don't talk about that. I needed someone who did talk. I drove down the quiet main street and pulled into a parking spot in front of the diner, the one with the flickering neon sign that just said, Eats. If secrets had a home, it was in a place like this, served up with lukewarm coffee and pie. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in. It smelled of old grease, coffee, and something sweet, like cinnamon. A few old-timers sat at the counter, stirring their drinks and talking in low murmurs. Behind the counter, a woman who looked like she'd been there since the town was founded was wiping down a surface that had probably been clean for 40 years. She had kind eyes, but they were tired, like she'd seen too many stories come and go. I sat at the counter and ordered a coffee. She poured it without a word, her movements practiced and efficient. I let the silence sit for a moment, stirring my coffee, trying to figure out my angle. I couldn't just ask about Vincent. Stanley's reaction taught me that name was a landmine, so I took a different approach. I pulled a faded photo of my mother from my wallet. It was one of the few I had, taken when she was a teenager before she met my father. Her smile was bright, full of a life I never knew. I slid it across the counter. Excuse me, I said, my voice quiet. I know this is a long shot, but I'm trying to find some information about a relative who used to live here a long time ago. Would you happen to recognize this girl? The waitress picked up the photo. She held it close to her face, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then her expression softened into a sad, distant recognition. Patricia, she breathed, her voice a little shaky. My goodness, I haven't seen this face in forever. Sweet, quiet Patricia. My heart leaped. You knew her? Everyone knew her, she said, placing the photo gently back on the counter. She was a good girl, got caught up in some bad things that weren't her fault. She looked around the diner, as if the walls might be listening. Like I said, a long time ago, she was shutting down just like Stanley. I had to keep her talking. I'm her son, Robert. I said. She passed away when I was a kid. I'm just trying to understand her life, the life she had here. Pity filled her eyes. Seeing me, her son, standing there after all these years seemed to crack through the town's wall of silence. That whole year was a tragedy, she said, her voice dropping lower. A lot of boys in this town were wild back then, especially the football stars. They thought they owned the world. Vincent? I asked, saying the name softly. She flinched, a quick, sharp movement. She nodded slowly. He was the king of them all, and he had his court. They were always together, inseparable. She leaned in a little closer, her voice almost a whisper. They used to hang out at the old Blackwood mine up on the ridge. That was their place, their kingdom. A lot of things happened up there, things people wanted to forget. The Blackwood mine. The name sounded ominous, cold. A kingdom for a boy king named Vincent. What happened? I asked, my voice tight. What did they want to forget? The waitress shook her head, pulling back. The door had closed again. I've said too much already. It's not my place. She picked up her rag and started wiping the counter again, a clear signal that the conversation was over. All I'll say is this, she added, not looking at me. That mine took more than just coal from this town. It took secrets too, and it never gave them back. I paid for my coffee, my mind racing. It wasn't a full story, but it was a breadcrumb, a huge one, a place, a kingdom, where a dark secret was born. I walked out of the diner and back to my car, the sun beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the forgotten town. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to find the truth in yearbooks or libraries. The truth wasn't in the town's memory. It was in the place the town tried to erase from its memory. I started my car and drove towards the ridge, towards the old Blackwood mine. I had to see what secrets a collapsed hole in the ground could keep for 40 years. I had to find what they buried that wasn't what they lost. The drive up to the ridge was a slow climb into the past. The road turned from worn asphalt to gravel, and then to little more than a dirt track swallowed by weeds. The trees grew thicker here, their branches interlocking overhead, creating a tunnel of deepening twilight. It felt like the world was trying to forget this place existed, actively growing over the scar. I parked my rental car where the track became impassable and got out. The air was cooler, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. A rusted chain-link fence, sagging and torn in places, was the only thing marking the entrance to the Blackwood mine property. A faded sign, barely legible, warned of unstable ground and trespassing. I found a section of the fence that had been pulled down years ago and stepped over it. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and the ghosts of old machinery. And then I saw it, the mouth of the mine. It wasn't a gaping hole like in the movies. It was a dark, collapsed maw, a wound in the hillside shored up with rotting timbers and choked with rockfall. It looked like a giant had taken a bite out of the earth and then spat it back out. This was their kingdom, a kingdom of dirt and shadows. It was too dangerous to even think about going inside. The waitress's warning echoed in my head. The mine took secrets and never gave them back. Maybe she meant it literally. I started walking the perimeter, my eyes scanning the ground. What could survive 40 years of rain and snow? What kind of trace would a group of teenagers leave behind? I kicked at loose rocks, my heart a dull thud of disappointment. This was a stupid idea. A ghost story from a sad town. I was about to give up, to turn back to my car and the sterile silence of my hotel room, when something caught my eye. A glint of metal half buried in the dirt near the base of a large pine tree, a few yards from the mine's entrance. It was probably just an old can, a piece of trash, but I knelt down anyway, my fingers digging into the cold, damp soil. It was small and flat. I pulled it free and wiped the dirt away on my jeans. It was a heart-shaped locket, silver, though now tarnished almost black with age. The chain was broken. It was simple, the kind of thing a teenage girl might wear. My breath caught in my throat. I fumbled with the clasp, my fingers clumsy with a sudden electric hope. It was stuck fast with years of grime. I used my car key to pry it open. It sprang apart with a tiny metallic click. On one side there was a space for a photo, but it was empty, a hollowed out heart. On the other side, however, there was an inscription. The letters were tiny, elegantly engraved. V+P, forever. My blood ran cold. Vincent and Patricia, my mother. This was hers. She had been here, with him. My mind reeled, trying to process it. This wasn't just a rumor in a diner anymore. This was real, tangible, a piece of her I could hold in my hand, a link to the secret she had carried to her grave. I felt a wave of dizziness, a strange mix of profound sadness for the girl she was and a rising tide of anger at the secrets this town had kept. They all knew. Stanley, the waitress, they all knew something, and they chose to bury it, just like this locket. When I got back to my car, I thought I had found the key to unlocking my mother's secret, but as I stared at the locket in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I noticed something else, a tiny detail I had missed. The inscription wasn't just letters. Below V+P forever, there was a date that made no sense. It was 2 weeks after the date on my own birth certificate. My heart hammered against my ribs. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. This wasn't a love story. It was something else entirely, something darker. The locket wasn't a promise of a future. It was a memorial to a past they had tried to erase, but I still didn't know what they were erasing or why. Finally, I had proof, not the whole story, but a piece of it so solid, so real it felt like a weapon in my hand. Carol and Martin had no idea what was coming. They thought they had beaten me, left me with nothing. They were living in my house, spending my money, laughing at the memory of my defeat. In a few weeks, they would be utterly ruined, their lives turned to ash. But first, I needed to find out who my mother really was, and what happened to her in that kingdom of dirt and shadows. The drive back to the hotel was a blur. The small silver locket felt heavy in my hand, like it weighed as much as the 40-year-old secret it represented. V plus P, forever. And a date that mocked my own existence. I sat in the sterile hotel room, the locket on the cheap wooden table, catching the light from the lamp. It wasn't a promise. It was a tombstone. My mind kept replaying the waitress's words. The mind took secrets and never gave them back. But it had given me this one piece. The town wanted to forget, but the earth remembered. And now I had to find out what it was remembering. The date was the only solid thing I had, a specific point in time, a day that changed everything for my mother, Patricia, and this mysterious Vincent. The next morning, I went to the county courthouse. It was a small, sad-looking brick building that seemed to be sagging under the weight of its own history. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and floor wax. A man who looked like he'd been part of the furniture since the building was erected sat behind a high counter. His nameplate read, Harold. He looked up at me over his glasses, his expression a perfect blend of boredom and suspicion. Can I help you? He asked, his voice a dry rustle. I hope so, I said, trying to sound casual. I'm doing some family research. I'm looking for public records from about 40 years ago, specifically for a date. I told him the date from the locket. Harold sighed, a long, weary sound, as if I'd asked him to move a mountain. 40 years ago, those records are all paper, down in the archives. It's a mess. Probably take you a week to find anything, if it's even there. He was already shaking his head, dismissing me. This was the town's wall of silence, made of bureaucracy instead of fear. I'm willing to pay for your time, I said, pulling out my wallet. I took out a few $100 bills and placed them on the counter. And I'd be happy to make a donation to the county's record preservation fund. Harold stared at the money, then back at my face. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't just seeing a tourist, he was seeing someone who wouldn't be easily turned away. He slowly reached out and slid the money off the counter. The preservation fund appreciates your generosity, he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. Archives are in the basement, keys on the hook. Just try not to make a bigger mess than it already is. The basement was even worse than he'd described. It was a tomb of forgotten paper. Rows of metal shelves groaned under the weight of decaying cardboard boxes and massive leather-bound ledgers. The air was cold and damp, and a single bare bulb did little to push back the shadows. I found the section for the right year and started pulling out boxes. Hours passed. My hands were covered in grime, and the dust was making my eyes water. I looked through birth certificates first, my heart pounding with a nameless dread. I didn't know what I was looking for. A brother? A sister? I found nothing. No births registered on that day, or the day before, or the day after. My frustration grew. Maybe the date meant something else entirely. An anniversary? A promise? I was about to give up when I saw a different set of ledgers on a lower shelf, their spines labeled with a single stark word, deaths. My hand trembled as I pulled one out. It was heavy, the pages brittle with age. I turned to the index, my finger tracing the list of names until I found the right date range, and then I saw it, a name I didn't recognize, a baby. I flipped to the page number, my breath catching in my chest. The record was filled out in elegant, old-fashioned cursive, a death certificate for an infant male, born 2 weeks before, died on the date etched into the locket. I read the details, my vision blurring, cause of death, failure to thrive, and then I saw the lines for the parents' names. Mother, Patricia, father, Vincent. It was like a punch to the gut. They had a son who lived for only 2 weeks. The locket wasn't for their love, it was for their loss. It was a memorial for a child they had buried along with their secrets. I felt a profound wave of sadness wash over me, for my mother and the tragedy she never spoke of. But as I stared at the page, a colder, sharper realization cut through the grief. I looked at the name of the baby again, and then at the last name listed for both Patricia and Vincent. It wasn't my last name, it was his, Vincent's. My mother had a child with him, a child who died, and my own birth certificate, dated from the same week that baby was born, listed a different man as my father, the man I had called Dad my whole life. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The dusty basement air felt thin, unbreathable. This secret wasn't just about my mother's lost love, it was about me. Who was I? Was I a replacement for the son she lost? Was the man I thought was my father even my father at all? The locket hadn't given me an answer. It had shattered my entire life with a question that was 1,000,000 times worse. I stood there in the silence of the basement, the single bulb buzzing overhead. The world had been a solid thing a few minutes ago. Now it was smoke. The death certificate felt heavy in my hand, a piece of paper that weighed more than a gravestone. My mother, Patricia, my not father, Vincent, a brother I never knew existed, and me, born in the same week. It was too much. It was a story so tangled that I couldn't couldn't find the beginning or the end. Was my whole life a lie built to cover a tragedy? Was the man who raised me, who taught me how to throw a ball and tie my shoes, not my real father? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in my gut. For a moment, I forgot all about Carol, Martin, and the divorce. Their betrayal was a shallow cut compared to this deep foundational wound. They took my present. This secret stole my past. I carefully placed the ledger back on the shelf and walked out of the basement, blinking in the weak afternoon light. Harold glanced up from his newspaper, not a flicker of interest on his face. I just nodded and left, the bell on the door chiming my departure from a life I thought I knew. Driving back to the city, my mind raced. The grief for a lost brother was real, but a cold, pragmatic fear was taking its place. My birth certificate. If the name on it was a lie, what did that mean for my inheritance? Rose had left her fortune to her grandson, but who was I, legally? If I wasn't the son of the man on my birth certificate, could my claim be challenged? The thought hit me like a splash of ice water. Carol and Martin, if they ever found out about this, they would tear me apart. Martin would hire genealogists, private investigators. He would use this secret to argue that I wasn't the legal heir, that the entire will was based on a fraudulent identity. He would try to lock up the $340 million in court for years, bleeding me dry until I gave up. They wouldn't just take my past, they'd take my future too. The secret my mother kept to protect her heart had become the perfect weapon for my enemies. I didn't go back to my cheap room. I drove straight to the law firm that handled Rose's estate. A different lawyer met me this time, a calm, older man named Stephen. He had been my grandmother's personal attorney for over 30 years. I have some concerns, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. About my ex-wife. Her lawyer is aggressive. I'm worried he might try to contest the will, to make a claim on the inheritance. Stephen listened patiently, his hands folded on the polished desk. Your grandmother was a very thorough woman, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. She anticipated many things. The trust is ironclad. Your divorce is finalized. Your ex-wife has no legal claim to anything you inherit now. But what if they tried to challenge my identity? I asked, the words feeling like poison in my mouth. What if they tried to prove I wasn't who I say I am? Stephen's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He looked at me for a long moment, as if seeing something more than just a worried air. He seemed to understand the question behind my question. Rose knew there were complexities in your family's history, he said carefully. She took steps to protect you and her legacy from any such challenges. She was very specific. She knew that a simple birth certificate could be questioned in a high-stakes legal battle. He paused, then opened a drawer in his desk. She left this. He placed a thick sealed manila envelope on the desk between us. My name was written on it in my grandmother's familiar, elegant script. Your grandmother hired a private investigator about 15 years ago, Stephen explained. She tasked him with creating an exhaustive and legally indisputable record of your lineage, DNA tests, sworn affidavits, documents you've never seen. It's all in there. It proves, beyond any shadow of a doubt, who you are and that you are her sole, legitimate heir. The will stipulates that this envelope is to be given to you, and you alone. My breath caught in my throat. My grandmother knew. She knew all of it, and she had built a fortress around me before she was even gone. This envelope wasn't just paper. It was ammunition. It was the shield I needed and the sword I would use. They thought they destroyed me, but they didn't know about my grandmother's will or her secret. What would you have done with that kind of power and a thirst for vengeance? Comment your thoughts and share this story. Finally, I had the proof. Carol and Martin didn't know what was coming. In a matter of weeks, they would be nothing more than a bad memory, a cautionary tale whispered among their greedy friends. But first, I needed to open that envelope and face the final truth of who I really was. I left Stephen's office with the envelope feeling heavier than a brick in my hands. It wasn't just paper. It was the weight of 40 years of secrets, the weight of my grandmother's love, and now, the weight of my revenge. I drove not to my sad little room, but to a nice hotel downtown. I used the small advance the estate had given me for living expenses. I needed a clean, quiet place to open this. A war room, sitting on the edge of a crisp white hotel bed. I finally broke the seal. My hands trembled slightly. The contents spilled out onto the comforter. It was more than I ever could have imagined. There was no single birth certificate. Instead, there was a thick, bound report from a private investigator my grandmother had hired. His name was on the first page, Arthur. The report was a fortress of facts. It contained a court-certified DNA analysis comparing my DNA not only to Rose, but to samples she had preserved from my mother. It was a 99.99999% match. There were sworn affidavits from old hospital nurses, from neighbors who knew my mother when she was young, all corroborating the story of my birth. There were photographs I'd never seen, documents from another state, all woven together into an undeniable narrative. Rose hadn't just plugged a leak, she had built a dam. At the very bottom, Tucked into a separate sleeve was a letter. It was handwritten in my grandmother's elegant cursive. "My dearest boy," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are facing a fight. I am sorry for the secrets. Your mother made a choice from a place of fear, and I honored it. But I will not let that fear steal your future. This envelope contains the truth. It is your shield. Use it to protect what is yours. But remember, a shield can also be a weapon in the right hands. Be smart. Be strong. I have always been proud of you." A single tear traced a path down my cheek. The sadness of her loss mixed with a surge of something else, something cold and hard. A shield can be a weapon. She knew. She knew the kind of people I was up against. She knew I wouldn't just defend. I would attack. Carol and Martin had laughed at me. They had called me a failure, a nobody. They saw me as a weak, broken man they could kick aside. They had no idea who I was. They had no idea who my grandmother was. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Carol. "Heard you came into a little money from your grandma. Don't forget you still owe on the credit cards I so generously let you use. Martin says we should check if that inheritance is marital property." The arrogance, the sheer, unblinking greed. They couldn't even wait. They smelled money and came circling like sharks. They thought they were hunting. They didn't realize the bait was being set just for them. I deleted the message and called Stephen. "I've read everything," I said, my voice steady and clear. "It's perfect, but my grandmother was right. I need more than a shield." There was a pause on the other end. "What are you thinking?" Stephen asked, his tone cautious. "They won't stop," I said. "They'll try to tie this up in court forever, hoping to bleed me dry. Defending isn't enough. I need to dismantle them. I need to find every skeleton in their closet, every dirty deal Martin ever made, every lie Carol ever told. I want to know everything." Stephen was silent for a long moment. I could hear him breathing softly. "That is an aggressive strategy. They left me with nothing," I said, the words like chips of ice. "I'm just returning the favor. I need the best person you know for this kind of work. Someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty." He sighed, a sound of resignation. "There is a man. His name is James. He's a forensic accountant and investigator. Very discreet, very thorough. He used to work for the government. He finds things people don't want found. I'll set up a meeting." 2 days later, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop with James. He was a man who seemed to blend into the background. Plain clothes, quiet demeanor, but with eyes that missed nothing. I told him everything. The divorce, the inheritance, the envelope. I told him about Carol and Martin's message. James listened without interruption, sipping his black coffee. When I was done, he just nodded slowly. "Greed makes people sloppy," he said, his voice low. "A lawyer like Martin who wins at all costs, he's cut corners. I guarantee it. And your ex-wife. People who are obsessed with image and money usually have a very fragile foundation. Can you find it?" I asked. A small, thin smile touched his lips. "I can find anything," he said. "It just costs money." "I have money," I replied, feeling the power of those words for the first time. His smile widened slightly. "Good," he said. "Then let's go digging." The plan was simple. James would start with Martin's law firm. He'd look for financial irregularities, questionable client accounts, anything that hinted at fraud or money laundering. At the same time, we'd let the bait out. I would have Stephen file some preliminary paperwork with the probate court, but we would accidentally include a note about a potential challenge to the will based on a disputed document. We would make it seem like I was worried, like there was a crack in my defense. It was a piece of cheese in a very large, very expensive mousetrap. Carol and Martin would be so busy chasing the money, so sure of their own cleverness, that they wouldn't even notice the walls closing in until it was too late. They thought this was their game. They were about to find out they were just players in mine. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. It was James. His voice was as calm and flat as ever, which somehow made the news more shocking. "I have it," he said without any preamble. "It's a network, not just one account, not just one shady deal. Martin has been running a parallel financial system through his firm for at least a decade." I sat down on the edge of my cheap mattress, the springs groaning in protest. "What do you mean, a parallel system?" "I mean he uses client trust accounts as a short-term slush fund," James explained. "He moves money around, invests it for a few days or weeks, and then puts it back before anyone notices. The profits go into a series of shell corporations registered offshore. It's clean, it's sophisticated, and it's highly illegal. It's wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering all rolled into one." A cold silence filled my small room. I could hear the traffic outside. People going about their normal lives, completely unaware of the financial web being spun just a few blocks away. "And Carol?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "She's a beneficiary of one of the main shell companies," James said. "She's received 6 payments over the last 2 years, totaling over $200,000, long before your divorce was finalized. It looks like Martin wasn't just her lawyer. He was her business partner." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Their arrogance, their confidence in court. It wasn't just about winning a divorce case. They were protecting a much larger, much dirtier secret. They weren't just taking my money. They were laundering their own through my life's destruction. "Send me everything," I said. "It's already on its way to you on an encrypted drive," he replied. "The mouse is in the trap. Now you just have to decide when to snap it shut." 2 hours later, Stephen called. His voice was laced with a kind of professional excitement. "They did it," he said, almost laughing. They actually did it. Martin filed a formal challenge to the will this morning. He's claiming undue influence and citing a recently discovered personal letter from your grandmother that supposedly changes her intentions. It's our document. They swallowed the bait, hook, line, and sinker. I looked at the small, heavy package that had just been delivered by a courier. Inside was the encrypted drive from James, the weapon. They're so sure they're smarter than everyone else, I said to Stephen. They think they're playing chess, but they're just checkers in a game they don't even understand. What are your instructions? Stephen asked, his tone turning serious. I thought about Carol's smug smile in the courtroom. I thought about Martin patting her on the shoulder. The two of them, a victorious team. They had celebrated my ruin. They had built their success on a foundation of lies and theft, and they used my pain as the mortar. That evening, I met James in the same quiet coffee shop. The encrypted drive was in my jacket pocket, feeling like a block of ice against my chest. He had a laptop with him. He didn't order coffee this time. He opened the laptop and showed me the labyrinth. Folders within folders, spreadsheets that tracked movements of money with dizzying speed, emails written in coded language, a digital ghost empire built by Martin, with Carol as one of its princesses. It was a masterpiece of criminal accounting. The Internal Revenue Service would have a field day with this, James said quietly, closing the laptop. So would the FBI. A man like Martin, he has enemies, other lawyers he's cheated, clients he's stolen from. Once the first crack appears, the whole dam will break. I looked out the window at the city lights. Each light was a person, a life, a story. Carol and Martin saw them as numbers, as opportunities. They moved through the world like sharks, seeing only what they could devour. They had tried to devour me. Finally, I had the proof. I had the weapon. Carol and Martin had no idea what was coming for them. They were probably at some expensive restaurant right now, toasting their cleverness, celebrating the final nail they thought they were putting in my coffin. In just a few days, their world would be set on fire. Their names would be mud. Their freedom would be a memory. But first, I needed to make sure the fire was hot enough to burn it all to the ground. We don't go to the authorities yet, I said to James. He raised an eyebrow, the first flicker of surprise I'd ever seen on his face. We leak it, I said, my voice low and steady. We give one piece of it to a financial journalist, someone hungry, someone who won't let go. Let the media be the match. The feds can be the gasoline. James stared at me for a long moment. Then a slow, thin smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a craftsman admiring a well-designed tool. I know just the person, he said. The meeting was set for the next day. It wasn't in a coffee shop or a dark alley. James chose a place of cold, hard efficiency, a rented anonymous office in a glass tower that scraped the sky. It was the kind of place where billion-dollar deals were made and broken with a signature. A room with no personality, only a purpose. The journalist's name was Jessica. She was in her late 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a face that looked like it had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She didn't offer a handshake. She just sat down, opened a notebook, and said, James tells me you have something that could make my career or get me killed. I'm interested in the first option. My heart was pounding, but my voice came out even. It's about a lawyer named Martin, and a network he's built. Financial crimes, massive fraud. He has partners. I didn't mention Carol by name yet. One step at a time. Jessica's pen didn't move. I get tips like that 3 times a week. They usually lead to a disgruntled employee with a grudge and no proof. James slid a single thin file across the polished table. This is one transaction, he said. A shell corporation based overseas buying a piece of commercial real estate downtown through another shell corporation. The final beneficiary is a trust. The trustee of that trust is Martin's former law partner. The money used for the purchase came from an account that was flagged by banking authorities 2 years ago for suspicious activity, but the inquiry was shut down. We've included the name of the federal agent who shut it down. Jessica opened the file. Her eyes scanned the pages, moving with a speed that was almost inhuman. For a full minute, the only sound in the room was the whisper of paper. Then she looked up, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something new in her eyes. It was hunger. This is verifiable, she said. It wasn't a question. Within 24 hours, James confirmed. If it checks out, Jessica said, closing the file, I'll need more, everything, and I'll need exclusive rights. My name is on this, my reputation. I'm not sharing the glory with anyone. The story is yours, I told her. All we want is for the truth to come out, every last ugly piece of it. She studied my face for a long moment as if trying to read the real story behind my words. Whatever she saw, it was enough. Check your email tomorrow, she said, and then she was gone. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I just watched a blank screen waiting. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, it happened. It wasn't a front-page expose. It was quieter, smarter. A detailed article on a highly respected financial news website. The headline was innocuous. Shadow financing raises questions about downtown property boom. But the article itself was a bomb. Jessica had laid it out perfectly. She didn't accuse Martin of anything directly. She just presented the facts from the single file we gave her. She connected the dots one by one, creating a picture of such blatant corruption that it was impossible to ignore. She named the shell companies. She named Martin's old partner. She even mentioned the federal agent's name in a single devastating sentence about the previously closed inquiry. At first, there was silence. For an hour, nothing. I felt a spike of panic. What if nobody cared? What if it was too complicated, too buried in financial jargon for anyone to notice? Then the first comment appeared below the article, then another, then 10 more. A link to the article showed up on a forum for financial traders. Then it was on Twitter. Someone with 1 million followers retweeted it with the comment, "This smells really, really bad." By evening, it was the lead story on 2 major cable news channels. They had experts on, financial analysts and former prosecutors, all dissecting Jessica's article. They put Martin's photo on the screen. They circled the name of his firm. They talked about what it could mean. Words like racketeering, money laundering, and federal investigation were being thrown around like confetti. I sat in my small room, the glow of the laptop screen lighting up my face, and I watched the world that Martin and Carol had built begin to burn. They didn't know it was me. They probably thought it was a rival, a disgruntled client, anyone but the man they had left for dead. The phone rang. It was James. His voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of satisfaction. "The first crack in the dam just appeared," he said. "Now the water pressure will do the rest. The FBI will have no choice but to open a formal investigation now that it's this public. They can't afford the embarrassment." I looked at the screen where a news anchor was saying Martin's name again. The fire was spreading faster than I ever could have hoped. The media was the match, just as I'd planned, and I knew the gasoline was on its way. The gasoline, as it turned out, was fear. The day after the article dropped, the stock market opened. Martin's firm wasn't publicly traded, but many of his biggest clients were. Their stock prices started to wobble. Investors hate uncertainty, and an article connecting a major law firm to shell companies and money laundering was the definition of uncertainty. The financial world is a house of cards built on trust, and Jessica's article had just set the foundation on fire. James called me around noon. His voice was steady, like a doctor reading a patient's chart. "The partners are turning on him," he said. "I have a source inside the firm. They're holding an emergency meeting right now without Martin. They're trying to figure out how to cut him loose before he sinks the whole ship." I imagined the scene. A long, polished mahogany table, grim-faced men in expensive suits who had praised Martin a week ago, now scrambling to save themselves. They weren't loyal. They were just rats on the same boat, and they could smell the water rising. "What about Carol?" I asked, my voice quiet. "She's been calling his office nonstop. His secretary is under orders not to put her through." A bitter smile touched my lips. So much for their unbreakable partnership. When the money was flowing, they were a team. The moment the pressure hit, the first thing he did was cut her off. She was a liability now, a loose end. I pictured her in that big, empty house they stole from me, her perfect life cracking around her like cheap plaster. The designer clothes and expensive jewelry wouldn't offer much comfort now. That evening, the story escalated. A second news outlet published a follow-up piece. They had found one of the investors from a shell company, a man who thought he was investing in a legitimate real estate project. He claimed he'd been defrauded, that his money had vanished. He was angry, and he was talking. He was the first real victim to come forward, giving a human face to the complex financial crimes. Now it wasn't just an article. It was a scandal. The next morning, the dam broke completely. The State Bar Association announced it was launching an official inquiry into Martin's conduct. His photo was everywhere now, no longer the smiling, confident shark from his firm's website, but a grainy, unflattering shot that made him look like the criminal he was. "It's time," James said on our next call. "The public pressure is at its peak. The feds have been watching, waiting for the right moment. We're going to give it to them." He explained the final piece of our plan. The single file we gave Jessica was just the appetizer. James had held back the main course, a separate file containing irrefutable proof of wire fraud with transaction codes and bank records that led directly to offshore accounts in Martin's name. It was the kind of evidence that didn't just suggest a crime, it screamed it. "We've sent it to a contact at the Department of Justice anonymously," James explained. "With the media storm in full swing, they can't ignore it. They'll have to act immediately to avoid looking incompetent." I spent the rest of the day glued to a live news feed on my laptop. I didn't eat. I barely breathed. I just watched, waiting for the final act to begin. It happened just after 3 p.m. A news helicopter was suddenly hovering over Martin's downtown office building. The camera zoomed in on the street below. 2 black SUVs, the kind you see in movies, pulled up to the curb. Men in dark suits with FBI printed in bold yellow letters on their jackets stepped out. They moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that was more terrifying than any frantic raid. They walked into the shimmering glass lobby of the building that Martin saw as his kingdom. I watched them disappear inside. The camera stayed fixed on the entrance. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The news anchor was talking excitedly, but I couldn't hear the words. All I could hear was the frantic beating of my own heart. This was it. This was the moment I had dreamed of, the culmination of every sleepless night, every ounce of pain they had put me through. Then the camera panned up to the windows of Martin's corner office on the 40th 30th floor. I couldn't see inside, but I could imagine the chaos, the shock, the dawning horror on his face as he realized his world was over. He was no longer the puppet master. He was just a man in a cage, and the walls were closing in. My phone buzzed. It was a text from James. Just 5 words. They have him. It's done. I leaned back in my chair, the tension draining out of me so fast I felt lightheaded. I looked out my small window at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, the man who had destroyed my life was being put in handcuffs. Somewhere out there, the woman who had laughed at my ruin was realizing she had bet on the wrong horse. The fire had reached them, and I knew with absolute certainty that it would burn everything to the ground. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. I still needed to see the ashes myself. The fire had reached them, but watching on a screen wasn't enough. I needed to see it up close. I grabbed my keys and drove downtown, parking a few blocks away and joining the small crowd of onlookers held back by police tape. I saw him then. Martin. He wasn't being dragged out kicking and screaming. It was worse. He was walking between 2 FBI agents, his hands cuffed behind his back, his expensive suit looking rumpled and cheap under the harsh glare of the flashing lights. His face was pale, his eyes darting around wildly, not with fear, but with pure, undiluted rage. He was looking for someone to blame, for an escape hatch that wasn't there. For a moment, his eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto mine. There was no recognition, just the blank stare of a predator who had finally been trapped. The news cycle was brutal and immediate. It was the lead story everywhere. Power lawyer Martin arrested in massive fraud scheme. One headline blared. Another showed a picture of Carol, looking horrified as she was ambushed by reporters outside her favorite luxury boutique. Socialite implicated in multi-million-dollar conspiracy. Her world, built on stolen money and social climbing, collapsed in a single afternoon. Her friends vanished. The invitations stopped. The country club membership was revoked. She was a pariah. They had laughed as they took my small world apart piece by piece. Now the entire world was watching as theirs was obliterated. The investigation unfolded like a cheap drama, but the consequences were very real. James's team had given the Feds a perfect roadmap. They uncovered offshore accounts, fake corporations, and a long list of clients Martin had systematically cheated, using Carol to identify wealthy, vulnerable targets within her social circle. They were a team, a venomous partnership that preyed on trust. The law firm bearing Martin's name imploded within a week. Partners resigned, clients fled, and a mountain of lawsuits buried what was left. The trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming. I sat in the back of the courtroom for the verdict, wanting to see it with my own eyes. Martin and Carol sat at the defense table, separated by their lawyers. They didn't look at each other. He looked old and defeated. She just looked empty. When the foreman read the word guilty on all counts, a small gasp escaped her lips. Martin just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. He was sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison. Carol got 15. They lost everything. The houses, the cars, the stolen money, all seized to pay back the victims. 6 months later, I got a letter. It was from the warden of a maximum security prison. Martin had requested to see me. A part of me wanted to throw it away, to leave him to rot in his self-made hell. But another part, the part that needed to close the final chapter, knew I had to go. I walked into the visitor's room. It was a sterile gray box that smelled of disinfectant and regret. He was already sitting at the metal table behind a thick pane of glass, wearing a drab orange jumpsuit. He looked like a ghost. His hair was gray, his face was gaunt, and the arrogant fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, hollow emptiness. He picked up the phone receiver on his side of the glass. I picked up mine. "You came," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You asked," I replied. He stared at me for a long time, his eyes searching my face for something. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why go to all this trouble? You had the money. You could have just disappeared and lived like a king. Why burn it all down?" I thought about his question. I thought about the nights I spent sleeping in my car, the humiliation in the courtroom, the sound of his and Carol's laughter. "You didn't just take my money, Martin," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You took my life. You enjoyed it. You and she. You celebrated my destruction. You thought I was nothing, an insect to be crushed. You were wrong." He leaned back, a flicker of the old arrogance returning. "So this was all for revenge? To see me in here?" "No," I said. "This wasn't for me. This was for your other victims, the ones who didn't have a secret fortune to fall back on. This was for them. You're here because of what you did, not because of what I did." He looked down at his hands on the metal table. He seemed to shrink, the last bit of his bluster deflating. He was silent for a full minute. "She blames me," he whispered, not looking at me. "In all her letters. She says I ruined her life." He gave a short, bitter laugh that sounded like cracking stone. I guess we got what we deserved. That was it. The close closest he would ever get to an apology. A flicker of something human in the wreckage. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I stood up and placed the receiver back in its cradle. I didn't say goodbye. I just turned and walked away, leaving him in his gray, soundless world. As I stepped out of the prison gates and into the bright sunlight, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt quiet. The fire was out, the ashes had settled, and for the first time in a very long time, I was free. From a cardboard box to prison gates, I didn't just get my life back. I exposed their destruction for all their other victims. What did you think of my justice? Subscribe for more intense stories.